Well, welcome, and thank you for joining us for another episode of our virtual town hall. Tonight, we're having a conversation about the climate emergency. I know there's some folks who are just joining us on Twitter and Facebook, so welcome. Some of you are logged in. Apparently, 1,500 people have already RSVP'd at andrewromanoff.com, and you can always find past episodes of our town hall meetings at andrewromanoff.com/live. We have two special guests joining us tonight, one coming on a little later. Is Bill McKibben, environmental leader, co-founder of 350.org, and really one person who's done more than just about anybody else I can think of to put the climate crisis front and center on our policy map. I'm very pleased to welcome my friend Diana Bray, who is a psychologist, a climate activist, until recently a candidate for the United States Senate, and a supporter, I'm honored to say, of our campaign now. So Diana, I want to say thank you very much for joining us. I hope you and your family are doing well.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here. And yes, my family is doing well. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, let's just jump into a conversation because I know you and I have a number of things in common, including an interest in mental health. I'm not actually a mental health professional. I just play one on TV, but you're a psychologist. And I thought it'd be interesting to ask you a little bit about that field and how you made the transition or maybe multiplied your expertise around psychology, mental health, and climate activism, which I know has been your life's work for the last decade or so. Can you tell us a little bit about your interest in those two fields?
Yeah, sure. Actually, I wanted to be a psychologist from the time I was a teenager, and I took my first psychology class in high school. I grew up outside of Washington, D.C., and I still remember that class and how it impacted me. And so I actually majored in psychology at Millbury College, and then I went to University of Denver for my doctorate. And I've been working as a therapist and also a professor. I worked at American University for 10 years, and I also worked at University of Denver with a real interest in trauma and loss. And I've also been in private practice. So that's what I've been doing for 30 years. And about 10 years ago, I got very, very interested in the climate emergency, and we didn't call it that then, but very, very interested in issues related to climate change. So that became a hobby of mine, alongside the interest in psychology and mental health.
I think we could use your skills right now, especially because the pandemic has created a co-occurring crisis around mental health. I know nationally I've seen an increase in calls to the crisis line ninefold between this time now and last year. Would not be a surprise to me, although I haven't seen these tragic statistics, that there is an increase in attempts at suicide or depression, anxiety. And we've had, and I know you've made an effort here too, tried to address some of those issues at past town halls. What can we do to weather the storm?
Yeah, well, it's a really important question. And I think one thing we have to recognize is that this is not necessarily a storm that's going to be fast moving. This is a storm that we're going to have to weather for many, many months, if not years to come. And it's just so fascinating being a psychologist, but also being interested in the climate emergency, because essentially climate activists have been anticipating this. And it's already been happening worldwide, other kinds of crises. We've seen the fires in Australia. We've seen droughts and hurricanes increasing. We've seen the intensity of climate crisis. And so how we cope with all of these things that are coming and will continue to come will determine sort of how we survive as individuals, but also how we survive as communities and countries. And so I think that there's a lot that we can do to take care of ourselves within our families, but also we can do much more in terms of making better choices. And I think that there's a lot that we're all going to learn about ourselves, and also what kinds of things we can do to make changes that will be impactful in the years to come, not just while we're in the middle of this emergency.
You and I have had a chance to share that conversation at a number of stages in the Senate race over the last year or so. And my hope is that when we emerge from this pandemic, we don't just go back to normal, because normal wasn't good enough for folks who are facing unemployment or uninsurance, mental health or substance use disorders, inequality. I know has been a theme of your campaign as well. The huge gaps that preceded this pandemic have only gotten worse, and there's no reason to expect them to get better if we just resume business as usual, it seems to me.
Yeah, and I think that we can make all kinds of different choices that reduce our consumption. And I think many of us maybe are already finding that we're making different choices within ourselves and our families now that feel quite good, actually. I think that sort of the way we were moving into such a highly consumptive country and world, the way that we had let go of things that were important and the way that we're fixated on our screens, as I'm speaking right now on a screen, all of these things I think have been really damaging to the human condition. And so I think that there's hope for us to make better choices and to consume less and to be more connected and stay connected. I mean, I was out today sort of in the garden, and I'm going to be helping to plant a neighborhood pollinator garden this weekend where we're going to be sort of doing it in grids where we have our own social distancing parameters. I was out, working with my bees today, and I think that there are major choices we can make. But I think part of the mental health challenge will be to try to limit our exposure to the news, actually. Because I think that some people are, and I fall into this trap as well, and there's also incredible writing at the moment and incredible media about what's going on. But I think you have to limit it, and especially with young children, it's not a bad idea to try to limit the exposure because it's very, very traumatic to be inundated with the news at the moment.
Let me ask you this question, because I'm getting inundated at my own request by text from folks. I've texted about 300,000 people in the last 4 or 5 weeks, engaging them in a conversation about what they're going through and how we can help. And even if you didn't turn on the news, you can feel this crisis in your own life. If your income has gone away, if your bills have not, you're worried about the loss of insurance. By some estimates, 35 million Americans may lose the coverage that's tied to their jobs. One of the reasons I think we should divorce employment and insurance. But at the same time, folks are wondering how they're going to ever get back to work. And I know you and I support a very ambitious plan. John Hickenlooper and Cory Gardner do not. But a Green New Deal that could employ millions of Americans in building the kind of clean energy infrastructure we need to combat the climate crisis and really to rescue life on Earth. Those are the stakes as I see them. I wonder, just with that in mind, what lessons we might draw from this pandemic about our ability to change behavior, because we've seen to some extent a decrease in carbon emissions and other greenhouse gases as human activity has slowed, as we don't drive as much and we're not moving around as much. Is that a fair conclusion to draw from this crisis, as much as we would never wish it to happen?
Yeah, well, I think we can also demand much more of our government. I think that our government, both city, state, and federal, can do a lot more to incentivize clean energy. And you're right, the Green New Deal is the model, is the way that we can move toward this transition. And we have to move toward solar and wind and renewables, and also incentivizing, cars, electric cars. So I think that there are many changes that we can make, but it's interesting because I was looking at a report on Delhi in India, and basically the government shut down Delhi, which is this enormous city. But what's happened is that the people themselves are deciding to stay in, and even as restrictions are being relaxed, people are saying, we're not going out. We only go out for groceries and medication, and that's it. And what's happened in one of the most polluted cities in the world, is that people can now see blue sky, and it's spectacular days, one after another, and the pollution is very diminished. So I think that we can learn a lot from these places that are doing things differently. And I think there isn't also an issue that relates to the way in which some places, including this state, governors are relaxing the restrictions. And that's going to happen this week here.
Right.
I think that people need to realize they can make their own choices. Just because the governor or the president of the United States says it's okay to sort of relax some of those restrictions, that might not be okay within your family or within your community. So I think the message here is that you need to figure out ways to protect yourself. Other people aren't going to do it for you. And if you decide that, you're going to, like, I'm in a high risk category. I turned 60 this year.
Happy.
I'm trying to hold off until there's a vaccine. in getting this disease. And, I'm going to be doing everything I can. So even if the governor says, yeah, we're going to start relaxing restrictions, we're going to have, we're going to be able to do less social distancing and isolating, I think we all have to make our own decisions on an individual level to try to stay safe, because no one's coming in to protect you.
I'm reminded we got a plea from one of the folks who joined us. I think you saw this panel too last week, Diana, in this case, a grocery store worker, a meat cutter, who said, look, you're coming into the store. He works at a Safeway in Lakewood. You're not wearing a mask. You're endangering me and other folks. So even in the absence of a requirement, could you please put on a mask just for the sake of the staff and the other customers? And I thought it was something we could do, to your point, now, even before we adopt the requirement, as some communities are. Let me ask you, just with the two hats that you've worn as a climate activist and a psychologist, what does it say about our inability to address the climate emergency, to treat it as an emergency, even as we are making some changes that are necessary to respond to the pandemic? Are we just the proverbial frog in the pot of slowly warming water? I don't want to encourage our viewers to conduct that experiment, because it seems cruel. But this climate crisis hasn't gone away during the pandemic, and it's continuing to get worse every year. So what is it about us? We can talk about other species if you want, besides frogs and humans. But what does it say about us that we can't make the changes we need now, or in terms of both the practices we pursue as individuals and obviously the policies that we need to shape in government?
Well, you've heard the old joke that denial is not just a river in Egypt. And
yeah, I've heard that one.
I think, denial is a defense, and our defenses in most cases are protective. And one of the reasons that I believe that people haven't focused on the climate emergency is, first, because it feels so daunting and enormous. But the second reason is because typically it doesn't affect everybody in the entire world. So when someone is impacted, or when a community is impacted, or when a country is impacted, say like Australia, with what they experience with the fires, or when there's some, tremendous hurricane or drought, those people are impacted. But the people who are not directly impacted tend not to act on what has happened to other people. And I think that's what's so uniquely unusual about this particular pandemic, because we now have a situation where literally the entire world is impacted. And so, yes, you could say this virus got people's attention, and that now people might be interested in trying to make changes, reduce consumption, elect people who are interested in addressing this emergency in a way they haven't before, just because psychologically maybe they didn't have firsthand experience of what this is like.
One person who, as you and I both know, has done more than just about anybody in the world to bring this crisis to global attention is Bill McKibben. And since you are responsible in part for establishing this connection, I want to say thank you for supporting me, and give you the honors of introducing Bill as well, who's joining us tonight too.
Yeah, well, thanks very much. Yeah, I've been an admirer of Bill's for, I think, about 20 years. I think I came back for a alumni gathering at Middlebury College. It was at least 20 years ago. It was right when you had first arrived. And you were an absolute hero. I remember my friend Larkin McPhee, who's the niece of John McPhee, the great writer, said, we have to go hear Bill McKibben. He wrote The End of Nature. And I didn't know you at the time. And in addition, Bill was a tremendous ally for us in Colorado when we were trying to pass Proposition 112. He came out here. We did get 1.1 million progressive voters saying, no, it doesn't make sense to frack in people's backyards. He started 350 with a bunch of Middlebury kids, mid-kids, and led the divestment movement effort, which has just been absolutely phenomenal in terms of bringing energy and attention to the existential crisis of our time. So yeah, it's great to see you, Bill, and I can't wait to sort of hear your interpretation and understanding of what's going on here.
Bill McKibben, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Andrew. And Diana, thank you so much for all the work that you've done for so long, and for your political maturity in this moment that we're in now. That's just the kind of thing that we all need to be doing. And it's really a pleasure to join you. I kind of wish I was there, in real life, because I kind of wish I go anywhere in real life. The last trip that I took before the pandemic set in was to the Roaring Fork Valley in midwinter. To my friend Auden Schindler had asked me to come out and do some work for them there, and it was a wonderful reminder of just how beautiful Colorado is and just how many good people there are from one end to the other, from Grand Junction to to every corner of the state. So what a privilege to get to join you tonight and just say, Andrew, good luck. We need leading things, because right now, with the climate crisis on full boil and with a country that needs to come out of an economic possibilities, and it's remarkable to see other countries around the world beginning to grab those possibilities and do things with them, and we need to get some change in Washington so we can too.
Well, thank you. A couple things. First of all, I want to say I'm a long-time admirer, first-time viewer. So thank you for joining me. Thanks for your support in this campaign. Thanks for your leadership more than anything else in putting this issue on the map. I know you were for climate action before climate action was cool. So I have a million questions to ask you. Your audio and video are not quite synced, but I think the audio is sticking around longer than the video. So we'll be sure to capture your words. And for folks who are joining us, I feel like a talk show host. Bill McKibben, world's leading environmentalist, joining this conversation. We'll be rebroadcasting this, or at least posting it on our site at andrewromanoff.com/live when we're done. Maybe we could start, Bill, just by picking up where Diana and I left off and asking what this pandemic teaches us about our ability to solve the climate crisis. It's a big question and a big issue.
It's a good question, and I'm sorry about the internet. I live out deep in rural America, and one thing you might want to work on in Washington is broadband for rural America, because we're reminded in the course of this crisis. I mean, it's one thing to tell kids to study from home, but if they don't have a way to get easily on the internet and things, that's, it's advice doesn't help very much.
100%.
If you ask me, there are three real lessons that come out of the pandemic that we should be taking to mind. The first one, it seems very simple, trite, almost cliched. It's that physical reality is real. But this is a point that it's hard to get across. We live in a world where, we're on screens all the time. Reality seems manipulable. I've spent 30 years trying to explain to people that you can't actually negotiate with or compromise with physics and chemistry. The CO2 molecule is going to do what it's going to do. And this crisis is teaching us the same thing about biology. Does not matter if the president gets up there and starts going on and on, it's a hoax, or, we're going to be fine by Easter or whatever. The COVID microbe is setting the rules here, not us. If it says you got to stand 6 feet apart, then you got to stand 6 feet apart. That's just biology. So reality is real. And second, and I guess it's a kind of corollary, is delay is a very bad idea. The US and South Korea had their first cases of coronavirus on the same day in January. South Koreans went to work. They started disrupting things, no big gatherings, we're going to test everybody all the time. They're now looking at this thing in the rearview mirror. We, engaged in 6 weeks of fantasy play where it was going to go away, or, the cases will go to zero or whatever it is. And as a result, not only do we now have to disrupt things in a truly huge way that's shut down our economy, we also have a, enormous death toll and injury toll and fear toll as a result. The analogy to climate change is very real. Had we started to flatten the carbon curve 30 years ago when scientists first told us about this, we could have done some pretty easy things, a modest price on carbon, something like that, and we would have ended up in a very different place. Now, that's not possible, but we still have to move as fast as we can. Speed is still the IPCC has told us we got 10 years to make fundamental changes, or else the chance of meeting the Paris targets are by the board. Third thing, last thing, social solidarity really turns out to be important, crucial. You know, I'm an old guy. I've lived most of my life in the shadow of, political shadow of Ronald Reagan, and the idea that markets were going to automatically solve all problems, that kind of laissez-faire, just work on getting rich kind of thing was how to go. Reagan's most famous line, his big laugh line, was, "The scariest words in the English language are, 'I'm from the government and I'm here to help.'" Ha ha. Those are not the scariest. The scariest words in the English language turn out to be, "We've run out of ventilators," or "the hillside behind your house is caught on fire." Okay.
Yeah.
And in neither case can you solve these problems by yourself. You have to be able to come together with other people. And the name that we give to coming together with other people is government. And that's what you need to be able to do to deal with problems of this scale. So there are no silver linings to a pandemic, but if we're going to go through this much pain and trauma, we might as well learn a few things. And we might as well not just sort of set up the pins in the bowling alley again either. We might as well make some changes while we're working on the scale we're working now, so that we emerge with a new and better normal.
That is a terrific distillation of the points, and maybe we could go through each of these in rapid order. And again, I'm grateful for your time, grateful for the several thousand folks I think who are joining this conversation. So when it comes to, let's go through these science, speed, and solidarity, I'll say, so for the sake of my memory here. When it comes to the science, some of the evidence I've seen suggests that pandemics like this, or at least outbreaks that are deadly, will become more likely as warmer temperatures drive the spread of disease-carrying species around the world. Is that how you read it?
Yeah, now we do not think that COVID-19 is directly related to climate change, although there's no question that as we do environmental damage, like cut down more and more forests and bring people in wilderness closer together, the chance for what are called zoonotic outbreaks increase. But many, many, many other forms of disease are directly related to the rapid rise in temperature. The biggest, what the World Health Organization has said is the emergent disease of our century is something called dengue fever, a mosquito-borne disease, which I've actually managed to catch in Bangladesh. And my strong advice to people: do not catch it if you can avoid it, because it's a pretty bad thing to get. But it's spreading very fast because the mosquito that carries it is spreading very fast. If someone was looking at our planet from a distance through a telescope and trying to understand why we were changing the atmosphere so fast, a reasonable explanation would be that we had embarked on a kind of planetary scale mosquito ranching experiment. And that's who likes the warm, wet world we're building. Someone else who likes it is ticks. And so in my part of the world, in the Northeast, I don't know about Colorado, but where I live, Lyme disease is now spreading at an astonishing pace. And not only is it making people sick, Andrew, it's changing our relationship to the natural world around us. All of a sudden, people are scared to have their kids go off into the woods and play, or even walk across a field. And for those of us in Vermont or in Colorado who value the outdoors, those kind of changes are really powerful, even if they're not killing us.
But I think the science is settled, and we're not going to host a debate. We should be done with that debate, but we should be talking about how long we have to act. And you talked about the importance, Bill, of speed. Obviously, if we were having this conversation 30 or 40 years ago, we could afford to indulge the sort of incremental approach that some people are still proposing. How long ago did the oil companies know about the damage they were doing?
So the oil companies knew before I did. I mean, I wrote the first book about this in 1989. But we
Right.
now know from good investigative reporting at the LA Times, at Columbia Journalism School, and elsewhere, that the big oil companies knew by the early 1980s what was going on. And if you think about it, of course, that makes sense. Like Exxon was the biggest company in the world. They had great staff of scientists, and their product was carbon. So of course they were going to find out what was happening, and they did. We now know from whistleblower accounts and from archives that they knew everything. Someone uncovered last year an Exxon internal document that showed with uncanny accuracy, and this was from the early 1980s, what the temperature and the CO2 concentration would be in 2020. They had it nailed, and they were believed within the company. Exxon took a look at this research and started building all their drilling rigs higher to compensate for the rise in sea level that they knew was coming. But they didn't tell any of the rest of us. Instead, they invested lots of money across the whole industry in building that kind of architecture of deceit and denial and disinformation that has kept us locked in a completely phony debate about climate change being real or not for 30 years. A debate both sides knew the answer to at the start, is just one of them was willing to lie. And I mean, if you think for a minute about the resources that they've been able to bring to that lie, then you have some sense of why we're in the predicament we have. And Coloradans are in a particularly good place to have a sense of what those resources mean. I will not soon forget the referendum fight over the setbacks for fracking law. People went into that because it's such common sense that you wouldn't want this in someone's yard, People went into it with a big lead in that referendum poll. And then the fossil fuel industry spent more money than they've ever spent on any campaign in Colorado. And I remember being there at the height of it. They'd bought all the TV time there was to buy. They were used to, driving trucks carrying billboards up and down the highways on the Front Range. I mean, it was crazy. And so, yes, they were able to win. And we also, so that power of the fossil fuel industry and their money, that's the thing that people have been trying to take on so hard in recent years. And it's why things like this divestment campaign have been so important and happily gotten so big. We're at $14 trillion now in endowments and portfolios that have divested in part or in whole from fossil fuel. And it's put a great deal of pressure on these industries.
I'll tell you, the dynamics you're describing and this sort of David and Goliath fight feels fairly familiar to me in our campaign. I'm up against not just one, but two fossil fuel funded candidates who both oppose the Green New Deal and the kind of bold climate action we should take. So I'm hoping the outcome of the story is closer to the one in the David versus Goliath tale, and rather than the referendum, the initiative that you mentioned.
It's always worth remembering.
What's
always
that?
worth remembering. I'm a Sunday school teacher. It's always worth remembering that David did indeed win. I mean, that was the point of the story.
We've been using Star Wars analogies too, especially after the 4th yesterday. And I told one of my team, it was born after the movie came out. I said, where I feel a little like Luke Skywalker. And she said, well, didn't he win? She remembered that much. Let me just ask you, while we're sticking to the subject of the time, how fast we need to act. I've been having conversations in person when that was possible, and now by text with folks all across the state. I mentioned to Diana earlier, I've texted probably 300,000 people in the last month. And a lot of them understand the science, but they're concerned about the economic impact. They get the fact that fossil fuels are by definition non-renewable, but they figure we don't need to make this switch quite so soon. We certainly can't make it tomorrow. And they want to know that when we do, that there's actually going to be jobs and income for them, because they're an industry that has supplied a lot of revenue to the state, that has met energy needs here in Colorado and the industry across the country. So I guess I'm trying to ask you two questions. One is, and you alluded to this earlier, how quickly can we make this change? And the second is, how do you tell folks in this field today that we're going to be able to employ them so they can continue to pay their bills and feed their families and meet their needs going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. Crucial questions. So the answer to the first is we have less time than we like because we've delayed so long. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the world's climate experts, issued a report in October 2018 laying out the latest science. If we haven't made fundamental transformations, was the way they put it, in energy use by 2030, and they defined that as cutting carbon emissions about in half, then we would have no chance of meeting the targets that we set in Paris, which are modest targets. I mean, we've already disrupted the climate quite seriously. As anyone who's looked at the snowpack in the Rockies, as anyone who's watched Colorado Springs and Boulder go up in flames, as people know. I mean, when you watch the bark beetle proceed to, so we need to make big change pretty quickly. And that is going to be difficult for people who have done the necessary and useful work of providing energy for a long time. But we have the resources to make sure that there is a just transition possible into doing the work that desperately needs to be done to allow a transition. Here's the good news. Over the last 10 years, the engineers, some of them working out of Colorado, have brought down the price of a solar panel or wind turbine by something like 90%. This is now the cheapest way to generate power on planet Earth. Day before yesterday in Abu Dhabi, which is maybe the best solar site on Earth, they signed a new tender offer for the biggest solar array on the planet. Going to be generating electricity for just above 1 cent a kilowatt, okay? That's what the sun is capable of, and the wind. So if we're going to build out those resources fast, we're going to need a lot of people doing that work. And truthfully, if we're going to overcome the recession/depression that we're now slipping into in this country, we're going to need a lot of people at work too. The oil companies aren't going to be providing those jobs. Their industry and their model is in deep trouble. It was in deep trouble before the pandemic, and now it's terminal. We've seen peak oil production on this planet. But there is incredible opportunity to employ people doing the work of renewable energy, doing the work of retrofitting homes and buildings in order to make them energy efficient. The good thing about all that is no one's going to put their house on a boat and send it to China to get it insulated, to get, air source heat pumps installed, to get solar panels on the roof of the garage, any of that. That's work that people have to do here close to home and can. So that's the good news.
Let me ask, just to press you a little bit on this point, Bill, even if the jobs you're talking about can't be offshored, as you pointed out, and even if there are twice as many of them by rough estimates in clean energy as there are in fossil fuels, some of those clean energy jobs don't pay as much. And the conversations I've been having with oil and gas workers go like this. Okay, we get the fact that the transition is coming. We can see the market already moving in the direction you just described, where solar and wind become cost competitive or better with oil and gas. But if you're going to put us to work now installing a solar panel or building a wind turbine, how do we know, and can you assure us that we're going to make as much money in those jobs as the ones we're leaving?
Well, that would be a good reason to send somebody to Washington to make good policy along these lines. That's what's good about proposals like the Green New Deal. The legislation that people are envisioning talk very seriously about precisely those kind of questions, because everybody gets it, The people who don't want action on this are the kind of voices of the status quo. It's not like environmentalists haven't been talking about a just transition for a very long time, but the Republican Party in particular has been holding energy workers as kind of hostages, coal miners, whoever, not allowing that kind of just transition funding and things to happen because it's more politically convenient to deploy people forever as kind of hostages.
Well, and it's pretty clear the same workers you're talking about have families who need to drink the water and breathe the air and live in some of the communities that are most affected. I want to talk a little bit about that in the context of the solidarity you suggested earlier. I'll just, one other number to throw at this conversation. Tell me if my estimate is off. I've seen a study that suggests if we added up all the direct and indirect subsidies we're providing for oil and gas and coal, the impact of the pollution that we're subsidizing, the amount is roughly $650 billion a year by one estimate. I'm talking not just about direct subsidies, but the indirect effects, which is roughly the size of the entire federal defense budget and 10 times the size of the federal education budget. So it seems to me putting those dollars into the research and development and construction of this clean energy infrastructure, transforming our electrical grid, our building codes, our transportation system would be a much better use of those dollars.
Well, you're either going to spend it doing that now, which would be a very good idea, or you're going to spend it putting out ever bigger forest fires for decades to come. I mean, it's not like the other choice is free, you know. I mean, allowing global warming to go unchecked would be the single most expensive thing that's ever happened on the planet. The latest estimates I saw for total cost of climate change unchecked towards the end of the century range upwards of $550 trillion, which is way more money than currently exists on planet Earth.
It turns out the Green New Deal is a pretty good bargain.
Yeah, green in both senses.
Yeah. What you talked a little bit about the solidarity we need, and the old line, which I remember from Reagan suggesting the government is the problem or the source of all our problems. It strikes me that if we want a clean energy future and an economy that works for all of us, we need a government that works for all of us. And that's not the government we have, because it's not just the subsidies that we're providing for oil and gas, coal industries, it's the subsidies those industries are providing for members of Congress. I know this is a family show, so I want to find a polite word to describe the system, but it essentially amounts to a legalized form of bribery, right? I mean, the corrupting influence, not just unfortunately on the Republican Party, but also too often on the Democratic Party, prevents us from taking the kind of action that you described. I'm not sure it's a question I'm asking, but a solution that we need.
Yeah, I think there's no question, you know. I mean, what can I tell you? I'm from Vermont, so our junior senator, Mr. Sanders, has been talking about this for a long time and the baleful effects of things like Citizens United. And I don't think there's that many people left in the country who disagree with him, except the Mitch McConnells of the world, who aren't going to let change happen. So time to make sure that change does happen. November is going to be, well, I mean, it's going to be a all or nothing election in an awful lot of ways. We need a different person in the White House. That's clear to anybody. I mean, you know, the fact that we made it through the first 3 years of the Trump administration without more crises than we did was a small miracle. Now we're seeing what happens when you have bad and incompetent people in office. But it's just as important that the Senate be a very different place too. And we need some powerful leadership there in the Senate. I have no doubt that that my friend Mr. Sanders would like to see some more allies flooding in to help with those fights.
But it strikes me it's not enough just to flip the Senate. We need to put folks who are committed to this cause in the Democratic majority.
Amen. Look at what happens when you get, you know, dynamic political leaders in. Look how important it was to have AOC elected to the House and how much that kind of changed the possibilities there. So those sort of things are really important, and it's why it's a good thing that you're running.
Well, I appreciate that. I may have to have you call my dad because he's not sold on replacing Trump. He voted for him in 2016. He's voting for him again. I tell folks the good news is my dad lives in Ohio, where I grew up, so at least he can't vote against me. I love my dad, but he's not in the same camp as you and I on this issue. I put out an email the other day, or maybe it was just a tweet suggesting that we're all in the same boat at the end. And somebody pointed out to me that's not actually accurate. We all may be in the same ocean, but some folks are sinking faster than others. And when you spoke about solidarity, it made me think about the impact that the climate crisis and pollution generally are having on low-income communities, on communities of color, on frontline communities, because this crisis is taking a disproportionate toll. Frankly, both the pandemic and the climate emergency taking a disproportionate toll on some folks. Part of the Green New Deal includes protections and mitigation and relief and recovery efforts for those communities. Do you want to just speak to that for a minute?
The iron law of climate change is the less you did to cause it, the sooner and the harder you get hurt by it. And so that means that the people who are doing most of the great organizing around climate change come from the kind of communities you were talking about. And particularly from indigenous communities, which have done an amazing job. North America, in South America, in the Pacific, all over the world, of being complete leaders here. These are the communities that have sounded the alarm and have raised the fight. And they are the communities that the Green New Deal and a special, it's not like it obviously is to everybody's benefit to make sure that things don't go out of control on planet Earth. And nobody, gets a free ride. I watched a lot of expensive looking houses burning up in Colorado Springs, when I looked at those pictures from the fires. But it is true that the people who need protection most and fastest are those living nearest the margins. And that just turns out to be as true of the pandemic as it is of climate change. So let's do it. Americans are generous and kind people. I hope anyway. That faith is being strained a little bit by the Trump years and things, but we need very much to come together in a way that we haven't come together for a while now, because we've got no more luxury, no more sort of easy years. We've got tough stuff to deal with, and we've got to do it together.
I'm mindful of experience I had years and years ago after I left college. I didn't get to go to Middlebury, but when I graduated, I moved to Central America. I ended up in Nicaragua in the wake of a very brutal civil war that our own government helped finance. And I think now about the families I lived with there, or families around the world, hundreds of millions, perhaps 1 billion of whom by the middle of the century may be forced to flee because of the pollution in part that we're creating. And it strikes me, as I put it to an audience last year, that you can't hardly blame somebody for fleeing their home when it's burning, especially if you help set the fire. And so I don't know what the prospects are for giving those folks refugee status, which they don't have now, but the estimates are staggering.
This is a absolutely crucial part of this question. So the UN estimates that on current climate trajectories, we can expect as many as 1 billion climate refugees by mid-century. If that happens, then the world will be a place just ruled by chaos and instability. I mean, we watched 1 million refugees come to Western Europe from Syria, and that discombobulated the politics of an entire continent. We watched about 1 million refugees, many, as you point out, fleeing drought that they did nothing to cause in Honduras, Guatemala. And that was enough to discombobulate our politics, to let President Trump scapegoat them and so on. We can't, no one can deal. And, people don't want, for the most part, to leave their homes. Everybody loves where they grew up. But if you have no choice, what are you going to do if you're going to starve? So we have to make sure that the planet doesn't warm like that. And then we have to figure out some ethic of solidarity that allows us to work together around the world. Let me tell you, if there's 1 billion people on the move, there are not walls high enough nor cages strong enough for that to be the solution, even if we were immoral enough to try.
That is powerfully put. And it's why this climate crisis is a moral crisis as well, and a real test, I think, of our character as a nation. I wanted just to continue our trip around the world. I'm sure you've been asked this before, but if you could point to a country or countries, examples, frankly, either in the United States or abroad, that are really taking this crisis with the urgency it demands and leading the charge. I'd like the United States to be the answer to that question someday soon, but where do you look for leadership now?
Look, the United States is not doing it on a federal level, but there are places in this country that are working pretty hard. And, you know, on a very big scale, California has started to do some things very right around this. They have no choice. They're pressed hard by climate change, but they also have understood that there's a great economic advantage to whoever leads the planet, you know, in production of batteries, in production of electric vehicles, in production of solar panels, those kind of things. They're seizing some opportunities, so that's smart. Around the world, you can find countries that have done really interesting things. The Germans have probably come farther than any big, big rich country. They're now at about 43% of their power from renewable energy. There are days when the sun provides almost all the electrical power in Germany, and which is amazing if you think about it, because nobody ever went to, you know, Germany for a beach vacation. It's been engineering and it's been political will. The Scandinavian countries, if we all, you know, behave like Norwegians, we'd probably all be okay in a lot of ways. But there are other places too. I did some reporting for the New Yorker a year or two ago in remote and poor parts of Africa. And it was remarkable to watch people getting their first power that they ever get power from the grid. It was never going to reach where they came. But now these things are cheap enough that people who, and you know, when you see it, Andrew, you truly appreciate what it means to live the way that we've all taken for granted. I mean, I was in a village that had just gotten that week a small solar mini grid, enough to power, provide a little power to every house. And so I was sitting with the elders, and this was in Ghana, so it was near the equator and very hot. I'm sitting with the town elders, and one of them kept handing me cold bottles of cold water, for which I was grateful because it was hot. But it took me, in my kind of clueless Western way, about 15 minutes to figure out why he was so proud to be handing me. They'd never had anything cold in that village before, you know. When you see that, you get a sense of what a miracle a solar panel is. You point a sheet of glass at the sun, and out the back comes light and information and cold and, you know, all the things of modernity. It's a kind of Hogwarts scale magic, you know, and we don't completely appreciate it because for us, it just substitutes for what we were doing before, but it is pretty remarkable to see.
I'll tell you, one of the most memorable experiences I took from the international development work I did in sub-Saharan Africa came in Ghana as well, visiting Cape Coast Castle and looking both at the door of no return and then on the other side, what's been branded the door of return. I'm hoping that we have not reached the point of no return in this crisis. I want to go from Cape Coast back to Colorado for a second. I'm running, as you know, against a fellow who doesn't agree with us on much of this, who sued communities that tried to restrict fracking, literally drank the fracking fluid, not a metaphor, just a bad idea, takes money from the fossil fuel industry, and not only opposes the Green New Deal, but compares these projects to the, in his words, the discredited ideas of Karl Marx and Joseph Stalin. Those are the kind of attacks you expect from a Republican, but in fact, that attack came from John Hickenlooper, my opponent now, my last opponent in the Democratic primary. So John won't debate me. He skipped 19 debates so far. His staff has largely ignored the request we made to them 2 weeks ago to engage in some debates. If you were debating John Hickenlooper, what would you say about a record or a platform like his?
Well, first of all, I would say thank you very much for your contributions to microbrewing. As a beer lover, I think that was a real good thing you did. And craft beer is what we should all be drinking, not fracking fluid. And the second thing I would say is, if you win the nomination, then I'd be voting for you, because it's going to be really key to make sure that Mitch McConnell's not back in power. But the third thing I'd say is time for new ideas. Time for some of the people who've been giving us, sort of leading us for a long time, to step aside a little bit and let in some of now the kind of new information. Because, if you've been around a long time, one of the things you get is this sort of sense of what can't be done. Oh, can't do that. There's some lobbyist who will be in the way. Can't do that. There's some vested interest who will stop me. Can't do that. It's, we've had a lot of can't, and we need some can, and we need it fast. I mean, that's, I'm getting older myself, so I know we need some people who are going to be willing to push the envelope, push.
Well, I'll tell you, I'll make the same commitment that you did and I did when I started this race. I'll support the Democratic nominee. I sort of support John over Cory Gardner no matter what. That's not a tough call for me, and I hope it won't be for anybody else. Our differences are not personal. They're just grounded in public policy. But I take your point too, Bill, and I think it was a great line that Senator Warren used when she turned to Congressman Delaney, I think it was, and said, I don't know why anybody would go to all the trouble of running for president just to tell us what you can't do and aren't willing to fight for. I mean, we need to summon the imagination of the country to and harness the willpower of the world to solve this problem. I've been using the New Deal as an example because it is the inspiration for the Green New Deal. But I think a lot, and maybe you can tell me if the analogy is off base here, but I think about the challenge that President Kennedy made to Congress and to the nation back in 1961, I think it was, where he said, before the decade is done, we will land a man on the moon and return him safely to the earth. We didn't have the technology to do that when President Kennedy issued that challenge. He didn't live long enough to see it met, but we got there. And to me, at least, this is our moonshot, right? It's I say a last in a lifetime chance to rescue life on Earth.
Well, and for that reason, it's very exciting, and not only a scary moment, but also a moment that's fraught with possibility. We're things are being reset right now as we're in this pandemic. One possibility is we'll just crawl out of it and try somehow to make sure that everything goes back to normal for a little while. As I said before, that's sort of like just setting up the pins in the bowling alley again. The other possibility is we'll take this moment and say, you know what? Our story's not over. It's not just about trying to limp back to where we were before. It's about taking seriously the challenges that we now understand in a new way that we all face. We all understand that things can come up and bite you in the butt, and you better pay attention to them. And so that's why it is an exciting moment. And you've got many predecessors that one can look at. I get to work pretty regularly on climate questions with Tim Wirth, who was such a remarkable representative of Colorado
Yep.
in Washington, and really was one of the people who got us first engaged in this fight on climate. And so I know what Colorado is capable of producing and adding to this fight,
I hope
I know what possibilities we have.
I'd be thrilled to follow in his footsteps. I want to, sorry, I'm cutting you out there. I know we only have a couple minutes left, so I want to, the last bit of time I got with you, at least today, I'm hoping maybe we'll bring you back at some point if you're willing. I want to talk about something that we really don't talk about as much, and that is the other creatures with whom we share this fragile planet. You wrote a piece that prompted me to reach out to you about a year and a half ago. I think it was in the New Yorker, talking about the loss of wildlife habitat. And it strikes me that even if you didn't care about our ability to survive on Earth as humans, you might take some sympathy for the other million species we've driven now to the point of extinction. They didn't sign up for this, but they don't get to vote. We're the only animals who do. And I suppose it's a good thing, because if they could, they'd probably vote us off the global island. So what lessons do you draw at this point in our history about our stewardship and our solidarity with other living creatures.
Well, you know, we're not doing a great job, Andrew. There are half as many wild animals left on planet Earth as there were in 1970 when I was in grade school. We've lost half the wild animals on the planet in that time. We lost in those fires in Australia at the beginning of this year, we think we lost a couple of billion animals, and we think 6 or 7 species went extinct in the course of those couple of weeks. That should be a great sadness for us and a great warning for us too. You know, we're part and parcel of this planet. Those of us who who take the Bible seriously think that one of the things we were charged to do was exercise dominion over this planet. That is, take care of it. And we're not doing a good job with that right now. And, you know, people in Colorado, unlike people in other parts of the country or the world, still have some sense of what the world's supposed to look like. You all are blessed with those beautiful high mountains, with those, you know, the plains that head up into the Front Range, with the great mesas out there in the west, you know, with the river. You have some sense of what this world's supposed to look like. And perhaps that imposes on you an extra burden to take care of it, you know? You know what we're giving up if we let it go. You see it every day. And so that's why I think, that's why I think Coloradans in the end will do the right thing and make sure that we do everything we still can to keep this as beautiful and connected and vital a planet as is possible. It would be a terrible thing to be the first generations of people who leave the planet a way worse place than we found it. But that's where we're headed unless we change fast.
I would like to help lead that change. I want to say thank you for leading this change for more than 3 decades now. It is really, I know you hear this a lot, but for me at least, it's a real honor to talk to you today, to have your support in this race, and I know to continue to follow your leadership. I think there will be lots of creatures, human and otherwise, able to survive because of the work that you've done. And I can't think of a better legacy. You're not ready to call it quits. So.
Back at you, and it's a privilege to get to talk with you, and good luck. And thanks again to Diana too, for what a pleasure to get to see her and just know how many good people there are. Some of the best environmentalists I know are hard at work at 350 in Colorado, and you know, all the other environmental groups and things that are working there. It's one of the places that, as you know, helps define our sense of what's possible. So good on you for taking this on, and good luck.
Thank you. I want to say thanks to Bill McKibben, and thanks to the folks who have joined us. If you want to see a replay, go to andrewromanoff.com live. And if you want to help us win this fight, go to andrewromanoff.com/yes. andrewromanoff.com/yes. Hope you and your family stay safe and healthy. Thank you for joining me tonight.